Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitridge, the alternate historian. Guys, I think I found the world's oldest alternate history map.
This is Our Country as Traders and Tyrants Would Have It. It was published in 1864 by H. Lloyd and Company of New York. It showcases an America divided between four states: the Confederate States of America, the Pacific States, the Interior States, or Intermediate States as it's called elsewhere, and the Atlantic States. The tyrants of the title are Napoleon III, who you can see in the bottom left presenting the crown of Mexico to Maximilian I, and Britain, which is represented by the lion in Canada. The trader is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, whose political beliefs influenced the Southern secession from the United States. You can see him off the coast of South Carolina.
And it looks like the snake next to him ate his lower half. Ouch.
To be honest, I wasn't able to find much about this map. It's obviously a piece of propaganda and not a traditional work of alternate history, but I will talk more about that later. I do know, however, that Boston Rare Maps said to their knowledge that no other map of the American Civil War era depicted such an extreme vision of a secession-torn United States. I also know that this map is very valuable, since a copy of it was sold at auction for $3,900 in 2016.
Hey! That map belongs in a museum, and by museum, I mean my house.
Joking aside, let's take a closer look at the map. For one thing, there is a lot of details on this map. We can see the names of towns, forts, Native American nations, rivers, and mountain ranges, which for a piece of propaganda is pretty impressive.
I also approve generally in how the Confederacy looks. The 11 states that seceded are there, along with a few additions.
For example, Kentucky being part of the CSA makes sense. In our timeline, they declared neutrality in the conflict, but after the South invaded, they asked the Union to drive them out. That said, a rural Kentucky state government did secede and join the Confederacy, but they never controlled the entire population of the state, and more Kentuckians fought for the Union rather than against it. Nevertheless, in a timeline where the CSA wins the American Civil War, which this map seems to present, it's possible for Kentucky to be a part of the Confederacy. The CSA also having half of Missouri makes sense as well. Much like Kentucky, they had a rogue state government that seceded and joined the Confederacy. Again, like Kentucky, they never controlled the entire state, and more Missourians fought for the Union rather than the South. That said, the conflict inside Missouri was much more intense than in Kentucky, with the state experiencing its own mini-civil war within the larger conflict. Thus, one could see in a timeline where the CSA wins the Civil War that they would split Missouri rather than try to occupy the parts that want nothing to do with it. The Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, being a part of the Confederacy makes sense as well, since the major tribes that inhabit the area were allied with the Confederacy. Some of the other additions make a little less sense. The Confederacy did have an Arizona territory that covered what would be southern Arizona and southern New Mexico today, but Our Country, as Traders and Tyrants Would Have It, only shows the CSA controlling New Mexico and not southern Arizona. This is an especially bizarre omission when earlier maps do recognize that the Confederate Arizona territory did exist. Then there is the iffy idea of having Maryland and Delaware be a part of the Confederacy. On one hand, both states were slave states and thus had that in common with the rest of the CSA. Plus, Maryland had a strong pro-Confederate populace and had to be essentially occupied by the North to keep them in the Union. Delaware, however, was pretty pro-Union and did not suffer such a fate as its neighbor, so while maybe I can believe Maryland being part of the CSA if the Confederate victory is lopsided enough, I'm not sure why this would mean Delaware would join too.
My theory is that Delaware would be saved such an indignity by an alternate version of Joe Biden, who instead of going into politics, travels the multiverse as a brutal vigilante. Sci-fi? Call me.
And finally, why the hell is West Virginia a part of the Confederacy? In our timeline, pro-Union Virginian counties rejoined the Union as the state of West Virginia after Union forces had driven Confederate troops out of the region. Now, while I don't doubt a victorious Confederacy may get West Virginia back, why would they keep it at its own state and not return it to Virginia? Moving on from the Confederacy, we need to talk about the other three nations on the map, the not occupied by the Japanese Pacific States, the Interior States, and the Atlantic States. At face value, these nations seem rather arbitrary. They ignore regional diversity or local populations like New England or the Mormons of Utah, who might want to go it alone rather than being part of some rump American nation. Some of the divisions of the territories in the West also make little sense, with part of Wyoming being fused to Idaho and Colorado being split down the middle between the Pacific and the interior states. Even the names don't seem that inspired. I mean, interior states? Really? Couldn't think of anything else for the Midwest, huh?
And yet I do find it to be plausible if you look at it in conjunction with how such a scenario came about.
For that, we need to talk about the tyrants, Britain and France. In our timeline, both were officially neutral in the American Civil War, but unofficially were sympathetic to the Confederacy, especially since the South was their main source of cotton. France also had ambitions to create a colonial empire in Mexico and invaded that country while the American Civil War was being fought, and an independent Confederacy might be useful in maintaining control over Mexico in the long term. The Confederacy also saw recognition and intervention by Britain and France as central to their goal of securing independence, and in my humble opinion, was probably the only way they could have won independence in the first place. It also explains why they toned down their rhetoric on slavery and instead said they seceded to protect states' rights so that their cause would be more palatable to the anti-slavery Britain and France. Luckily for America, Britain and France weren't fooled by such a cheap ploy and decided that the lives of their countrymen wasn't worth defending a slaveocracy.
But what if they did intervene? What if Britain and France joined the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy?
A popular point of divergence is the Trent Affair, an 1861 diplomatic incident where a U.S. Navy ship illegally stopped a British ship to remove 2 Confederate diplomats it was carrying. The incident was seen as a gross violation of Britain's rights as a neutral nation, and they responded by strengthening their military in Canada. Now, in our timeline, cooler heads prevailed, but let's assume things went sideways and Britain intervened. They would probably be joined by France, who only planned to intervene in the American Civil War if Britain did as well. Thus, Confederate forces are bolstered by British and French troops. Their combined fleets smashed through the Union blockade, which was stifling the Confederate economy, while British and Canadian forces open a new front against the Union in the North. Things go pear-shaped quickly, and the Confederacy not only finds itself independent, but with the rest of the Union defeated, demoralized, and divided. Thus, getting back to our country as traitors and tyrants would have it, if we look at it through the prism of a timeline where the American Civil War ended by the intervention of Britain and France, it makes a little more sense that the two empires would divide the defeated Union arbitrarily, without any regard to the local people and borders. I mean, just look at Africa in 1914. They did it before in this timeline, why not in another?
So while this map does have its issues, it's overall plausible. That said, it is more of a propaganda piece than a traditional work of alternate history.
My educated guess is that the creator of Our Country as Traitors and Tyrants Would Have It wanted to scare people on what could happen if the Union gave up now. 1864, the year the map was created, was also an election year, and there was a candidate running on a peace platform. Nevertheless, you can tell the map maker was a creative fellow and they had knowledge of geography and foreign affairs, which is something a lot of alternate historians have in common. So while not technically a work of alternate history, it's still in the same spirit, and because of its age, deserves a special distinction in our favorite genre. Who knows, maybe our anonymous map maker was inspired in part by asking, what if the Trent Affair led to war?
Well, that is not the same subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.